Okay, folks, I guess we'll get started. Thank you all for coming. The weather's beautiful. It's too cold to play outside for some of us anyway. For some of us, so thanks for coming. I'm Barry Griffith. I've lived here in town for 40 years, and when we first moved here, we saw a sign that said the Crown Point Road, and there was a Crown Point Inn that you may remember. Some of you older folks that were here 40 years ago. So I knew a little bit about Vermont history because I grew up in Bennington, the hotbed of the Green Mountain Boys, the Bennington mob, but I didn't know a whole lot about the Crown Point Road. And then, flash forward 20 years, our daughter went off to college, and suddenly Barb and I had plenty of time on our hands, and we saw in the paper one weekend that the Crown Point Road Association was leading a hike. So we said, well, let's go. We like to hike and we like history, and it was over in Plymouth, as I recall, and we wandered around an old road in an old cellar hole, and one of the longtime members said, well, I bet you the well is around here somewhere. He went over and picked up a rock, and there was the well, and I blew my mind at how these people knew that kind of stuff. So I was hooked. So I started joined that organization about 20 years ago and started learning more about the road, and everybody needs a hobby, and so I'm happy to tell you a little bit of what I know. We have some other members and other people very knowledgeable here. I'm going to thank Dale Christie in particular, who's our Minister of Defense, and he's also a computer geek, and there's others here. I'm not going to introduce everybody, but unless there's any questions, we'll get started. So, next slide, please, Dale. So, some basics about the Crown Point Road. It was originally marked and cut during what they call the French and Indian War, 1759. It then was used as a military road during the American Revolution. We'll talk about both of those. And probably just as important for the state of Vermont, it was a route that many came up here to Vermont to settle in between the wars. So that's its importance in the history of things. Next slide. Quick plug for the Crown Point Road Association. It was established around the 200th anniversary of the road back in 1759, and it promotes the Crown Point Road and tries to preserve information about it. And we, in the summer, we go out every month or so and explore, and in the winter we have meetings and do things like this. This picture was taken a few years ago. Over in Springfield. All of you are familiar with the interstate, which was built around 1959 or a little after. Early members of the Crown Point Road Association made sure the state put a tunnel under Interstate 91 where the Crown Point Road ran, and it's there today. And this sign we placed there a couple of years ago to replace some of the older signs that were 60 years old now. So,
where's the tunnel?
It's in Springfield, and I guess you can get there from Route 5 by going up through. There's an old cemetery and an old road, and then it goes through and it comes down on the other side. I've forgotten the name of the road on the other side.
Spencer Hollow?
Yeah, could be. Say that again?
Spencer Hollow.
Spencer Hollow Road. So you have to go through a field but we've led hearts there before, and in 10 years ago, to commemorate the 250th anniversary, we hiked end to end. A group of us, not everybody hiked every day, and a few hardy few camped out for the 2 or 3 weeks for the whole trip. But that was my last time through the tunnel, I guess. But maybe we'll go again sometime. So next slide. Anybody recognize this place? This is a picture from our 250th anniversary hike we did 10 years ago. Yeah, we'll come back to this later. So we're going to talk about the history and geography behind the road. We'll talk about the first marking and cutting, then the second marking and cutting, and we'll talk about a little bit about how the route continued to evolve after settlement, particularly here in the Shrewsbury area. And last but not least, I've done a little pictorial tour of area Crown Road markers and sites for you. So we'll keep going. So this is the big picture. This is what this is all about. I think everybody recognizes where we are. On the north, you have the St. Lawrence River coming in, which mainly was inhabited by the French during the settlement of America by Europeans. they went to Quebec, they came down to Montreal, they came down, as you know, the Lake Champlain, the Richelieu River drains out of Lake Champlain. And on the other end, if the Hudson River, which empties out here in New York City, works its way up to Albany and then continues up to what in those days where Fort Edward was. So that route was a route, first of all, used by the Native Americans for generations before any Europeans were here, and continued to be. There was also a side route involving the Mohawk River Valley as well. But this route was the route that was contested in the European wars, the American Revolution, and before that the French and Indian War. On the other side here, you've got the Connecticut River, which drains down, and the road connected the two, as you know. So next slide. This is a closer map of Vermont, an older map, and again, this is the upper end of Lake Champlain. The Crown Point is here. Fort Ticonderoga is here. On the other end, you've got the Hudson River coming up, and Fort Edward was here. On this side, you've got the Connecticut River. Fort number 4, which is in present-day Charlestown, was here. And so the road was connecting Crown Point and Fort number 4, and you can see it on this old map. The interesting thing to me is that 1609, this was, I guess, a time for exploration, and the Frenchman Samuel de Champlain came, and he came up up the St. Lawrence River. He came up the Richelieu River into Lake Champlain, called this land we live in Vermont, the Green Mountains. Made it as far, I guess, as Ticonderoga. What's interesting to me is about a month, year before or after that, Henry Hudson came down and started in New York City, and he worked his way up about to here. So within a month or so of each other, those folks were, 50 miles apart in this wilderness, and they heard about the connection, but they didn't make it that year, although the Native Americans had been doing it for years. So next slide. This is again a map showing the road in 1759, starting at Chimney Point, or near Chimney Point, near Fort Crown Point, working its way down. It stays on the west side of Otter Creek until it gets down into the Rutland Clarendon area, then crosses over to Shrewsbury and keeps going down to Fort number 4. What happened as the 1700s went on was that the French established an outpost at the lower end, or the upper end of the Lake Champlain, Fort St. Frederick, and they used that, they and their Native American allies used that to raid Boston and places in Massachusetts and places south. In response, the colonies built a number of settlements and forts along the way. In particular, in 1744, they built the fort at number 4. There's a replica there today, and that was sort of used as an upper, the end of the road as far as the colonists in Massachusetts were concerned. And that was in part to make sure they could detect raiding parties coming down from the north and from Chimney Point. So those were the points early by 1740, and then if we move ahead 10 or 15 years to the next slide, here's a map that I think is another way of looking at this. In Vermont, you can't always get there from here. Looking at the mountains first, there are the Green Mountains. There's probably one good place to go through, which seems right here if you look at the topography, and that's pretty much where Route 103 runs these days, and in Shrewsbury. If you look on the other side, the map, I mentioned earlier that on the western side of the state, the road follows the Otter Creek for the most part, down here. It then humps over in Shrewsbury, connects with the Black River, and then crosses over the Black River and stays on the east side of that, going down to Springfield and then on to Charlestown. So, next slide. we'll move on to the French and Indian War. Any questions about what I've said so far before I keep going? Okay, the Seven Years' War, when the Crown Point Road was first cut and marked. By then, we've talked about some of the earlier forts, the ones at Crown Point and Number 4. At the outbreak of the war, the French had built another fort even further down, Carillon they called it. The British knew it as Fort Ticonderoga. And that was on the northern end of the Lake George here. For their part, there was a settlement for many years down in Albany called Orange, but we talked about Fort Edward, which is up here, and the British responded and had a fort there, and there were numerous raiding parties going back and forth between these two points for years. In 1758, the British forces went up the lake, or went down, I guess, down into the Fort Ty and tried to capture it, tried to capture Carillon. It was a bloody defeat, very, very devastating defeat for the British, but things changed in the following year, which was 1759. And this is a map just basically showing that the war was going on. There were several raiding parties that General Amherst at that point was in charge of the British forces. He sent one up the St. Lawrence around this way, sent another raiding party over to the Great Lakes, and finally went up through the military, the highway we just talked about, to Carillon and Lake Champlain. The French forces by then realized they were outnumbered, and they abandoned the lake in August. And so the French retreated to Canada. Amherst was at Crown Point on August 4th, and he could have continued, I suppose, to try to chase the French all up into Canada. But he decided to halt and to build that fort and to regroup for the following year. So he actually did several things at that point. One of the things he did was send a party over to the Great Lakes to reinforce the battle there. He sent Rogers Rangers up north to attack the Indian settlement of Adanac, and that was a real massacre. But the third thing he did in that time was to send somebody from Rogers Rangers to cut a road, and that would take us to our next slide. And the first person to lead that was John Stark. I think you've heard of him. We have a nice monument of him in Bennington. He was the hero of the Battle of Bennington, among other things. But in 1759, he was a captain, and he was put in charge of 200 individuals. And Amherst told them, go from here down to Number 4 and come back. So they left in August, came down, and returned about a month later, September 9th. Stark said, I did it. It's 77 miles long, and that's pretty good measurement even today. So that was the first cut, and then if you move forward another month or so, at the end of the war, when the colonial troops were returning home, at the end of that conflict, they had all gathered and been fighting in that corridor. Amherst told John Hawks, who was from Massachusetts, you take your troops and take the other troops from New England, and you go back, take them through Fort Number 4, take them down that Crown Point Road, cut it on and improve it on the way, and then when they get to Fort Number 4, you can discharge them, give them money for the rest of the way back to their homes. So part of this was for the troops to march back and forth, but also very importantly, it was for cattle. Amherst knew if he was going to have troops on Lake Champlain, was going to be invading Canada, you have to have some food to sustain them. So he made arrangements to get cattle from Boston. And after the road was cut in that latter part of 1759, it's reported that 5 droves of cattle, about 80 head each, were driven up Fort Number 4 and then over the Crown Point Road to Lake Champlain. So as much as it was about moving people, it was about moving meat on the hoof. And that was accomplished in 1759. So let's move forward. This is some excerpts from a note. One of the reasons we know about the road and how it was built and where it went was from journals that various soldiers kept along the way. These are some notes from Robert Webster, who was with that party coming down. They left Crown Point. 11 days later, they were at Otter Creek. Our bread is gone. We're very hungry. We camped at Otter Creek. Snow was out by now. It's November. We made a bridge for footmen to go over Otter Creek. They stayed 3 or 4 days on Otter Creek in the Clarendon area, and then finally moved on November 10th, 3 miles, and then camped, which probably would have been right here in Shrewsbury somewhere. And then 6 days later, they were at number 4, had beef and turnips for supper, and then they got their money and went home. So that was what happened in 1759. If we move ahead to 1760, this was at the beginning of the campaign. Amherst had asked for troops to come up, including a party from New Hampshire that was led by John Goff. And what Goff did was assemble his troops around the conquered Manchester area. There's a Goffstown there where Goff grew up. And they started from there and worked their way up to Fort Number 4. That road was fairly well, had been there for a while. And then finally they got to, around July, they got to Fort Number 4. This party spent a week or two in that Fort Number 4 area. They put a ferry across. They put a blockhouse on the ferry going across the Connecticut River. And then they worked their way up. And then when they got about as far as the Black River Ponds, around where the present-day Tyson is, they were cutting. At that point, the original road was here, and Goff was built cutting a little north of that for maybe thinking it was a better route. But they got notice that the troops were invading Canada. Stop cutting that road and get up here and help us fight the French. So they stopped building the road. They dropped down 2.5 miles to the Hawks Road, went up to Crown Point, and kept going. And sure enough, the French surrendered that year in August. So that was the end of the French and Indian War, at least in these parts. So that was So there was basically road building for 12 months, 13 months, 3 parties, over 13 months in the French and Indian War. So next slide. After that, during the French and Indian War, there were no European settlers in Vermont. I would say for the most part, Bennington didn't get settled until I think the first folks showed up there in like 1769 or so. There may have been a few around Brattleboro, but once the war was over, settlers from New England and New York were moving north into Vermont, and many of them came over the Crown Point Road. And next, Dale. This was just a chart I got somewhere showing that when first settlers arrived, 1761 for Bennington, which was the closest to downstate New England. By 1775, there were nearly 600 people there, Shewsbury 500, and so on, fewer and fewer as you got north. I'm not quite sure of the numbers for Wallingford and Clarendon. In 1774, how many Europeans were living in Shrewsbury? Anybody know? None. So other places were getting settled, but not up here in Shrewsbury. But we'll keep going. Now, I love maps, and this is a map one of our Crown Point Road members found over at the New York Historical Society. Social Bureau. We know because we know who won the war, and we know the Green Mountain Boys prevailed, and the New Hampshire Grants won the day. But back in those years between the French and Indian War and the American Revolution, and even beyond that, there was questions as to who had title and the right to the land between the Lake Champlain and the Connecticut River. New York claimed they did. And there were many battles that, if you know your Vermont history, you've heard about. After the war, Governor Benning Wentworth started granting towns like crazy, and New York was responding, and their governor sent a Will Cockburn, an infamous surveyor that the Green Mountain Boys loved to harass, up to map out a town called Socialborough, which basically was going to surround the Otter Creek. And you can see where its boundaries were in relation to Clarendon and Shrewsbury. If the British had won that battle between New Hampshire and New York, you might be going to Socialborough instead of to Rutland. But the interesting thing for us, a couple of things that are interesting about this, was a map from 1767. And what you'll see on here is the Crown Point Road was marked by Will Cockburn when he was up here in 1767. So in the early days, there was one, because the road went in different places before the American Revolution and after the American Revolution, there was always a debate about where it went and where it crossed the Otter Creek in particular back in those days. This map pretty definitively, this is Lake Nineveh. And we can see pretty clearly from this map that it went south of Lake Nineveh through here. And you can see it crossed the Otter Creek here in Clarendon and then stayed on the west side of the Otter Creek all the way up through. So from this map, we're fairly satisfied that was the route in the French and Indian War. That changed later, as we'll discuss. One of the interesting things about Socialborough, there's this line here is sometimes called Cockburn's line, and that is the line of North Main Street in Rutland, or Main Street. So it dates back to 1767, or maybe it was in use before then. But that's another interesting thing you can learn from this map, is that that route goes back a long ways, and I guess we can go to the next slide. Okay, so we're at our next war. American Revolution, again, we had a military route. So, as I just mentioned, sometimes the route was the same and sometimes it was different. And here are a couple of examples where the road was different. And I guess the next slide, Dale. One of those is in the Black River Ponds area that we talked about earlier. This is Route 103 here, and this is Route 100 here. Ludlow's down here. In 1759, the road that they cut essentially went parallel to Route 103 and came down and went through what they basically down the Shunpike Road and such that way. The later parties went further north. You can also see it on this map over here, above the lakes, and then cut down this way. Here's Lake Nineveh again. They went around this side of what they call Proctor Hill, to this area here where there was a encampment. But you can see this is quite a difference. This is probably shorter, and I imagine when John Stark was cutting the road, he wanted to get there as fast as he could. This road goes along the lakes. It goes along Lake Nineveh. My gut feeling tells me this was probably the route the Native Americans would tend to take back in the early days, because you could have the fishing and go from there. And this area, there are traces of the road that are still available and traceable in this area. The farm and wilderness camps are in this area here. But I think that hike I told you I went on some 20 years ago was along the road in this area. It's still a pretty well traceable road with several cellar holes on it from the 1776 road. And the other area where it was different was on the other side of Shrewsbury. Through Shrewsbury, it was pretty similar either way. We've got the next slide there, Dale. And this, again, is a map on the other side. Again, this is Route 7. This is the Cold River Road. Let's see where the Brown Bridge is. That's pretty identifiable. Here's Route 103 down here. Both roads sort of parallel Route 103 here. The road, as we talked about in 1759, crossed over to the west side of Otter Creek here. But by the time of the American Revolution, there were settlements, and there was a settlement and a tavern here at Pierce's Corner. And there was also a fort up here in Rutland. So in 1776, what the men did was camp here or stay at this tavern and then march up, essentially up Route 7, to Rutland, where there's a fort that we'll talk about later, and then head down West Street and cross they crossed the Otter Creek up there. And there was also a road that continued up into Pittsford and crossed up there as well. So those are a couple of examples. So just a quick history. I think most of you know this. In April, there was the Battle of Lexington and Concord. After that happened, hostilities were on. Ethan Allen wanted to capture Fort Ticonderoga and did. Benedict Arnold went with him too. The Battle of Bunker Hill. What the Americans did, or Ethan Allen did, and some of his troops after they captured Ticonderoga and Crown Point, was to continue north with the Montgomery expedition. One of my favorite Vermont Green Mountain Boy heroes, Remember Baker, was killed in a skirmish. Ethan Allen tried to capture Montreal, but he got captured instead. Toward the end of that year, the French evacuated Montreal and all went to Quebec. Benedict Arnold went through Maine, this tremendous overland area, and tried to attack Quebec and did not succeed in capturing it. So that was 1775, taking us into 1776. I don't know if any of you have heard about Henry Knox and the noble train of artillery. Essentially, at that point, Boston was under siege. The Redcoats were in Boston. The colonies, the colonial troops, were surrounding them. And General Washington said, now that we got all those cannon and things from Ticonderoga and from Fort and from Crown Point, let's get them down here to Boston. And so he gave Henry Knox the okay for that. So Knox went up, got 59 pieces of artillery. He arrived at the fort in December of 1775. They took that route that I showed you earlier down Lake George, down toward Albany, crossed the Hudson River near Albany, and went through Massachusetts. They got down to Cambridge at the end of January. A few weeks later, these cannons showed up above the British in Dorchester Heights. The British looked at them and realized that they were not in a good way, and Boston evacuated, the British evacuated Boston on March 17th, 1776, a day which is still celebrated as a state holiday in Massachusetts, Evacuation Day. I used to think when I was young that this train of artillery went down the Crown Point Road. That was mistaken. I was mistaken. This actually went down, as I said, to Albany and then over that way. However, one thing I learned last month, next slide, is that there was artillery that went over the Crown Point Road. Mm-hmm. Once the British evacuated Boston, they had all these cannons sitting around with nobody to shoot at. And General Washington said, well, we still have troops up in Canada trying to take over, trying to conquer Quebec. Knox, send some of this artillery up to Canada. So Knox ordered one of his captains, Ebenezer Stevens, to take 2 companies of artillery, about 180 soldiers, to go to Quebec. And they told him to go through Fort Number 4. So he went up to Number 4. He went across the Crown Point Road, and eventually, when he got to the Otter Creek, they built rafts and took the cannon down the river. They got to Lake Champlain. They got supplies from Crown Point, and they floated down Lake Champlain. They started working their way up St. Lawrence to try to relieve the troops who had a siege on Quebec. However, that didn't work. By then, the new troops had come in from England. The St. Lawrence iced up during the winter, so you couldn't get boats in. But by the time they got there, the river had warmed up. The boats got to Quebec with Guy Carleton and a number of British troops. So Quebec was saved, and northern Canada was saved, at least for then. And meanwhile, back on Lake Champlain, what happened there was that two things had happened. First of all, after the Americans, took the 2 forts, which was Ticonderoga to the south and Crown Point to the north, they had to decide on a plan of action. And what they decided to do was to build their defenses at Fort Ticonderoga, which is further to the south, but it seemed like a more defensible position. And what they did was build the fort, and on the other side was what came to be known Mount Independence. So in 1776, troops showed up here. There were at least 10,000 troops, I think maybe 13,000 troops stationed here at the end of the summer of 1776. Guy Carleton came down the lake with his forces and in his boats and troops. He took a look at the defenses and said, we could have a siege here all winter and stay out in the cold, or we can go back to Montreal and stay warm this winter. So he decided to go back to Montreal, and so the Americans lived to fight another day. And at that point, the troops here were sent home, many of them over the Crown Point Road. Next slide, I guess. There was a little slightly different road built during those days. Crown Point is up here. Fort Ticonderoga is lower, so there was a road built from Rutland through Hubbardton to Mount Independence for the troops for that during that war. And that would have been that they would have gone down that road back to Rutland, and then the rest of the way down the old Crown Point Road. So one of the things that I told you we learned about the Crown Point Road from diaries and journal entries, and one of the things we learned is that Lemuel White had a tavern here in Shrewsbury by 1776. He was, as far as we know, the first settler in Shrewsbury of European descent. He came over from Rockingham, over the Crown Point Road. He was undoubtedly aware of troops were going back and forth, so he set up a house and also set up some lodging for the troops going by. Here's a couple of entries from the history of Shrewsbury, from one soldier going home in November of 1776, that they got to Shrewsbury and it was raining. White that keeps the tavern hath but poor entertainment for both man and horse. And then they moved on to, they kept going, got down to Coffeens and Cavendish. And then the next spring we have another entry from somebody going north, that he marched to Mr. White's at Shewsbury, and then he marched to Bowman's at Tavern, which was Pierce's Corner, the next day. So that's how we know a little bit about the history of the Crown Point Road in Shrewsbury. This is where Julianne Smith-Sharrow and her family live now, and they've lived in that neck of the woods for generations. This probably isn't the original house, but it was originally originally the lot that was settled by Lemuel White. Eventually Nehemiah Smith, who lived next door, bought him out, and Julianne is descended from the Nehemiah Smiths, as are the other Smiths in Shrewsbury as well. So next entry. This is a marker over in Plymouth. I don't know, anybody ever been over there and seen this by any chance? It's Paul. A few of you have. This is on over near Lake Nineveh on the road toward Flying Cloud. There's a knoll on a hill, and according to history passed down from the generations, a soldier was going home, probably at the end of 1776. He was sick. He drew some water, and he drew his last breath and died there. And his fellow soldiers buried him on the top of this knoll, and that story and tradition passed down from generation to generation. The Boy Scouts down in Mount Holly marked that. In fact, I think at one point they actually exhumed the body to make sure, see if there was a body, and found a body and some materials that made it look like there was actually somebody buried there. And more recently, next slide, the Vermont National Guard put a marker up there. This is it showing on both sides. And this is officially the burial site of Vermont's unknown soldier. We don't know who he is, what he was doing, but there he is, and you can visit him this year if you care to. Give me a call, I'll take you there. So the third year of the Revolution, here's our John Stark in front of the Bennington Battle Monument. The British came back down the lake. This time they were ready, and when they got down, General St. Clair, who was in charge of Fort Ticonderoga and Mount Independence, decided he couldn't
keep it, so he gave orders to evacuate. They evacuated. There was a rear guard action at HUBBARDTON. What essentially the Americans said was, let's regroup, and we'll regroup down in Manchester, and we'll meet again. And they did in Bennington, and had a decisive effect there, helping defeat the forces. So that went on, and story has it the troops dispersed, and some of the British troops and some of their Hessian allies came. The story I've heard is that one of the Hessians, a party of Hessians, came as far as Lemuel White's Tavern here in Shrewsbury to see if any of the troops were going down the Crown Point Road, and if so, trying to catch up with them. They had actually turned south rather than coming through Shrewsbury, but there's a connection between Shrewsbury and that retreat in 1777, which led to the victory in October.
Shrewsbury wasn't a party town, so they left.
So the war ends, settlement continues, and the route changes to accommodate. Anybody ever seen this sign? I'm not sure if that was the sign that was there 40. When you go back, if you would. I'm not sure if that was there 40 years ago, but it's there now. It is the Crown Point Road. It's not the way the road ran during the American Revolution, but I think within decades after that it did, and I'm not sure. So what I thought I'd do next is take you on a pictorial tour of the area Crown Point Road markers. You can check off your list, see how many you've seen. And we'll start in Mount Holly. On the Kyle Perry farm. Anybody who's been there? Anybody been to Kyle's place?
Next to there, right?
Yeah. Beautiful spot. The Perrys are great stewards of the land, and it's kind of a watershed there. It's called It's a halfway encampment because the water on one side flows to the Connecticut River. The water on the other side flows into Otter Creek and onto Lake Champlain. And there's a beautiful little knoll there, and which was used for encampment not only by the Americans during the American Revolution, but by Native Americans for generations prior to that. There have been, I know some of the people who lived there and have done excavating and found things there. So that's a beautiful spot, and you can sort of see you're high on an area with water around, and you can see what's going on. We placed this marker in 2004. So that's, again, this is on the 1776 route, that northern route we talked about. And the next slide, a few miles away, is marker 34C, which is an older one. Well, not that old, 1997. It's essentially on the Shunpike Road. As you drive down to Harry's, you'll go by that before you get to the Nineveh Road. So if you're heading that way, it's on your right. It's sometimes easy to miss, but it's there, and so look for it next time you're heading that way. And then there's this marker, 34B, which is on the Snapdragon property, right pretty much there at the town line, Frank Lord Road. I remember years ago when the dump was over that way, we used to drive by and see it. It's there. John Davis and Penelope Weiss live there. They do a nice job maintaining that marker for us, as do many of the landowners.
Barry, is that the road? Was that the 1759 road? Like going by?
Yes, by then they sort of had come together there, back there by then. So, and again, you can look at this other map later if you want. They separated, and again, the road in 1776 still continued to go south of that mountain there, so this is actually on both of them, and the reference is to the 1759 road. So, near this site, which is all you can say as far as any of these go. And then we get to White's Tavern. We've talked about that already, and again, this is one picture on the right, at least, is a picture we took when we did our hike 10 years ago for the 250th anniversary. Julianne has always been very knowledgeable and gracious, and of course she loves her history as well. And then if you continue to the west, well, we'll take a break. Here's a map. This is a map that I guess Clyde Turnbow did a long time ago for the Historical Society, and I love maps anyway. And to set you up, a couple of things. This green line is Route 103, and this is the Mill River, and this is Lincoln Hill here, which goes here, and this is the Mitchell Road here, and this is where the Sharrow farm is. When they did these lotting maps, and not only in Shrewsbury, other places, one of the things they did was make lots 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 around the Crown Point Road. So Lemuel White was there, and again Nehemiah Smith across the way, so the road came down here. What it did was head out in the woods here somewhere. This is Great Brook here, and I don't know how much you. It doesn't seem like much if you get out and look though. That's a pretty steep valley. It's a pretty steep little brook there. And I think what they did to avoid that was to go a little higher up to cross it where the water wasn't running and it wasn't as deep. We've led hikes there as well. There was we did find an old deed from down here that talked about the property running up this far to Case's Road, and I think it talked about how many chains or feet it was. And one year, a while back, I took a 50-yard chain and we marked it out to the end of the road to see where it would have crossed, and it was pretty close to where we understood it would. So, and this is the old Gaynor Road here that some of you are familiar with. And we do think that this lower part of the Gaynor Road, at least part of it, was part of that original Crown Point Road, although it probably broke off this way more than before it, rather than going straight down as it does now. So that, again, I like maps, so I threw that in there. Marker 35 is on Lincoln Hill Road across from Munders. Oh, presumably you've seen that. This was marked in '94 by... both by this was marked by the Ann Story chapter. So the D.A.R. marked many of these markers, this one on June 14th, '94. We'll keep going. Have any of you seen this along the side of Lincoln Hill? If you go about a mile past where the last marker, if you go past Mitchell Road and work your way down before you get to Chesser's, if you look off to the right, you'll see this marker that was put in by the Crown Point Road to mark where it went off to the side. And if you go through there, through the Kelly lands, there are some old signs here, including this one that were probably put up 50 years ago when the Crown Point Road Association was young. And they're still out there marking that route, sort of cutting across lots there. And I guess we can go to the next one, Dale. And out there, if you go a little further out onto the Gaynor Road, a little below where the Clarendon Shelter is, there's this marker. Oh, I told you earlier that one of the things that General Amherst did was to say put cattle pens every 20 miles. One of our members, Al Ransom, made it a passion about trying to figure out where those cattle pens were, measuring and looking at the way stones were built. And he came to the conclusion that this site, and there is a pile of rocks there, was one of the cattle pens on that original 1759 route. I can't see it, but I tend to trust him. And so this marker is out there. Again, if you want to take a walk up the Gaynor Road, you'll come across that. If you don't want to take a walk, you can just drive by Route 103, and this is down there at the foot of the Gaynor Road, which says the markers are up 3/8 of a mile east of here. So we'll leave Shrewsbury and work our way into Clarendon. This is marker 39, which is at Pierce's Corner. I think most of you know where that is. This is again the 1776 road we're talking about now. John Smith, around 1775, built a tavern there. His son-in-law was Bowman, and the Bowmans owned it for generations, and then later the Pierces owned it for generations. And so this is one of those early markers. This was built, put in by the D.A.R. on June 14th, 1914. And we'll keep going. And here's another marker, and this is in North Clarendon, sort of near the post office on that old Route 7B. Anybody notice that? It's in there as well. Also marked on June 14th, 1914. Extra credit here. Anything significant about June 14th? Flag Day. So I don't know why all these markers were D.A.R. for whatever reason dedicated all their markers on June 14th. I guess because it's Flag Day. So and they were trying to commemorate the route, the American Revolution, War route. And the next statute, if you haven't seen this one, you really should. It's the Joseph Waite Monument, which is out in the field. I don't know, Al, who owns that property now? Do you know?
I don't know who does own it.
Yeah, it's because
I think Pinkowski still owns it.
okay, so this is down by Pinkowski's, sort of the four corners there. You know,
A fence around it?
it has a fence around it. So if you go in, it's a nice, very nice marker. Waite was a fought a very interesting guy. He fought in the American Revolution. He was injured in 1776 at the Battle of Valcour Island, which was one of the battles on Lake Champlain. Allegedly, his troops got him as far as Clarendon, where he died, and so he allegedly was buried there, although I've heard other stories as well, and I don't know if we want to get into those. This marker was placed for him at some point after that, a common country claims our aid, living or dying, I will defend her. So that's there, again, 1776 road. If you want to go across the river, you'll get to the 1759 road, and this is a marker that we dedicated, the Crown Point Road Association, back in 2002. And this is on the Crick Road. If you went out Alphretia all the way to the Crick Road, you turn south for half a mile or so, and that's where that marker is. And we'll keep going. Again, I love maps, so I threw this in here. This is an old map of Rutland from the Rutland Historical Society. Again, I've highlighted in blue. This is Otter Creek, and then you've got some other. This, I think, is the Clarendon River that comes down, and this is the East Creek that comes down. There were some early rights. It was divided into quarters. The Quarter Line Road. Have you ever wondered where the Quarter Line Road got its name? It's because it was dividing the town of Rutland back in the day into quarters, and that was the Quarter Line Road. And this is Route 7. Here, the Bowman Tavern would have been down here in 1776. The troops would have come up here to Fort Rutland. They would have then gone down West Street, down here to Fort Ranger, and crossed the Otter Creek down here. The Mead Tavern, James Mead had a tavern here, and so that shows where all of those were. And we'll go to the next slide. This is a sketch of what Fort Rutland looked like. This is, again, is the top of on Route 7 at the corner of West and Terrell. There is an old marker there from June 14th, 1901, placed by the D.A.R. And then down the road, down West Street, this marker, which is actually what do you call that? Drinking trough for horses. It says right there, drinking trough. That was marked there by the D.A.R. in 1903. It's been moved. If you look to the next slide, which I got courtesy of Dale Christie, this is an area. This is the road. Here's the marker. This is the railroad tracks. As you can see, we're looking toward Rutland. This, I guess, is what they now call East Proctor Road. And so originally, the watering trough was right here. You can see the old trolley that used to go out to Bombazine. See the horse and buggy. I'm not sure what year this was, but it's a great old picture. Later on, when they improved this road, they moved the marker over here, but that's where it was originally. And then, if you keep going, as I mentioned earlier, MEAD'S Tavern, there's a marker there as well, June 14th, 1912. And there's also a marker there indicating that's the junction of the HUBBARDTON Military Road. The Crown Point Road continues north. The Military Road headed off to the west. But I'm not going to take you there. I'm going to stop. I'm happy to entertain questions. There's a lot to cover, and I've covered some of it. But anybody has questions, I'll be happy to hear from you.